1895, Harlan Whitaker, the oil tycoon. The story of the slave kidnapping that shook America. The ledger was discovered entirely by chance on a sweltering July afternoon in 1895, when a sudden fire swept through the west wing of the Ravenswood Manor in Titusville, Pennsylvania. As servants scrambled to carry valuables from the burning building, one of them stumbled upon a secret compartment behind what appeared to be an ordinary bookshelf. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting, divided into 3 distinct columns: name, date, and location. But this was no business record or family genealogy. The first column listed over 350 names of men, women, and children who had vanished from the surrounding counties over the past 12 years. The second column recorded the date they were acquired. The third, and most chilling, column marked the date of their demise with a single word: disposed. The servant who found it later recounted that the ledger reeked of a rank chemical odor, one that reminded him of the oil rigs along the Oil Creek River. Local authorities quickly confiscated the evidence, and within days, the investigation was mysteriously closed. For 2 years, the truth about Harlan Whitaker would remain buried beneath layers of wealth, influence, and fear. Before we continue with the story of America's most disturbing family, remember to subscribe to our channel and let us know what state you're listening from in the comments. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers across the country. What happened next would shake the most celebrated success story of the Gilded Age to its very foundations, revealing how one man's bottomless greed led to horrors that would make even the darkest chapters of American history pale in comparison. Titusville, Pennsylvania, in the 1870 seconds, was a city drunk on the promise of progress. Oil derricks worked relentlessly day and night, pumping the black gold that would forge America's industrial future. At the heart of this transformation was the Whitaker Oil Company, a sprawling conglomerate of rigs and refineries that employed nearly 2,500 workers and produced some of the highest quality oil east of the Appalachians. The man who built this empire was as impressive as his industrial achievements. Harlan Whitaker stood 6 feet 4 inches tall with piercing blue eyes and a shock of golden hair that only added to his aristocratic bearing. Born to a humble farming family in New York, he had forged himself from humble beginnings through sheer force of will to become one of the wealthiest men in the Northeast. By 1880, at the age of 42, he owned not only the oil company, but also thousands of acres of farmland, 2 smaller mills, and a railroad line connecting Titusville to Philadelphia. His personal fortune was estimated at over $1.5 million, a sum that placed him in the ranks of the era's industrial aristocracy. But it was not just Whitaker's wealth that had made him a legend throughout Pennsylvania and beyond. It was his peculiar approach to marriage and family that had tongues wagging from Titusville to Philadelphia. Unlike the secret polygamists in remote territories, Whitaker made no attempt to hide his unique domestic arrangements. He openly maintained what he called his extended family. Multiple wives and dozens of children lived scattered across several magnificent estates. At the heart of his empire was Ravenswood Manor, a 35-room mansion that dominated a hill overlooking the Allegheny River. Built in the Victorian style with spires that seemed to reach for the Pennsylvania sky, the manor was home to what the locals called the primary family. 8 wives and 28 children lived together in apparent harmony. Each wife had her own wing, complete with a private sitting room and nurseries for her children. The arrangement was formalized through what Whitaker called spiritual marriage contracts, documents that gave each woman legal protection and financial security in exchange for their exclusive devotion to the family unit. Beyond the manor, Whitaker maintained 5 other properties throughout Venango County. These smaller estates, each a fortune in its own right, housed his secondary families, women who had chosen to live more private lives while still bearing his children and sharing in his prosperity. Oakwood Farm, 15 miles south of Titusville, was home to 6 wives and their 19 children. Riverbend House, a stately mansion near the Oil Creek River, housed 5 wives and 15 children. Each estate was a world unto itself, fully staffed with servants, tutors, and governesses, ensuring that Whitaker's children received the best education money could buy. The most remarkable aspect of these arrangements was that they were conducted in the open. Whitaker appeared at social events with different wives, attended church services with various combinations of his children, and frequently hosted lavish parties where members of all his families mingled freely. Titusville society, initially scandalized, had gradually come to accept and even admire the finesse with which Whitaker managed his complex domestic life. His wives were elegant, educated women who seemed genuinely content with their circumstances. His children were polite, well-dressed, and excelled in their studies. The society pages of the newspapers regularly featured the activities of the Whitaker clan. The Titusville Herald wrote glowing articles about Whitaker's wives, describing their charitable work and cultural contributions to the city. The Philadelphia Inquirer ran interviews with several of his older children, praising their academic achievements and social graces. Even religious leaders, after some initial hesitation, began to view Whitaker's arrangement as a unique form of philanthropy, providing security and purpose for women who might otherwise have remained single in an age of limited marital prospects. Local businessmen admired Whitaker not only for his success in the oil industry, but also for his apparent ability to maintain harmony among so many strong-willed women. They often joked in their clubs about his diplomatic skills and organizational genius. Some even consulted him for advice on managing their own single-wife households. Whitaker would smile graciously at such conversations, often remarking that his secret was simple: treat each woman as if she is the only woman in the world, and she will reward you with boundless loyalty. Behind this facade of domestic bliss, however, were subtle signs that not everything was as perfect as it seemed. A few of Whitaker's wives, when pressed by journalists, mentioned certain areas of the manor that were off-limits to family members. They spoke of mysterious nighttime deliveries to the estate, of strangers who came and went at odd hours, of areas in the basement that were always kept locked. When asked about these oddities, the wives would quickly change the subject, their faces showing a flicker of fear that went beyond mere discretion. The children also occasionally let slip comments that suggested a darker undercurrent to their privileged lives. Samuel, Whitaker's 9-year-old son, once told a playmate that his father had a special place where bad people go to learn to be good. Eliza, aged 11, told her governess that she sometimes heard sad whispers coming from beneath the floor of the manor's library. When adults questioned these children about their remarks, they became confused and claimed to have no memory of what they had said. Most disturbing were the observations of the servants and workers on the Whitaker estates. Several maids reported finding oily stains and chemical smells on clothing brought down from the restricted areas of the manor. Gardeners mentioned strange tools and equipment being delivered to basement entrances that seemed to have no legitimate household purpose. Kitchen staff noted that enormous quantities of food were being prepared daily, far more than the known residents of the estate could possibly consume. Yet, no official guests were ever announced. The women themselves, despite their outward contentment, exhibited behaviors that suggested a deep-seated anxiety. They rarely traveled alone, even into nearby Titusville. They seemed reluctant to speak of their lives before joining the Whitaker family. Most tellingly, none of them had any contact with their families of origin, a fact Whitaker explained by saying that all his wives were either orphans or had been estranged from relatives who disapproved of their unique lifestyle. By 1885, Harlan Whitaker's reputation as both an oil genius and a master of domestic harmony was firmly established throughout the Northeast. Visitors from as far away as New York and Boston came to see his oil facilities and observe his unique family arrangements. He was often mentioned in the press as a potential candidate for governor of Pennsylvania, with editorials praising his innovative approach to both business and family life. The future seemed limitless for the man who appeared to have solved the age-old problems of loneliness and want by simply ignoring conventional limitations. Yet, even as his fame grew, whispers began to circulate in the immigrant neighborhoods of Titusville and in the homeless encampments along the railroad lines. Stories of people who had gone to seek work at the Whitaker Oil Company and then vanished without a trace. Tales of shadowy figures who haunted the city's poorest districts, making offers that seemed too good to be true. Reports of families who had answered advertisements for domestic positions on the Whitaker estates and were never seen again. These whispers might have remained just that, the paranoid fantasies of society's most vulnerable members. Had it not been for a rainy September evening in 1885, when the first crack appeared in Harlan Whitaker's carefully constructed empire of prosperity and desire, the autumn of 1885 brought an unprecedented labor shortage to the industrial heartland of Titusville. The economic boom that had swept the Northeast created more jobs than there were workers to fill them, and factory owners found themselves in fierce competition for skilled labor. This made what was happening at the Whitaker Oil Company all the more puzzling. Unlike his competitors, Whitaker never seemed to have trouble staffing his mills. While other industrialists offered signing bonuses and raised wages to attract workers, Whitaker's workforce seemed to replenish itself effortlessly. New faces regularly appeared in his refineries and on his derricks, men who worked with a silent efficiency and seemed content with wages that were actually below the regional standard. When asked about his recruitment methods, Whitaker would smile and explain that his reputation for fair treatment attracted the best workers from all over the region. The truth, however, was far more complex and sinister. John Callahan had been the foreman at Whitaker's refinery for 7 years when he first began to notice the strange patterns in worker attendance. Unlike other factories where employees built relationships and formed social groups, Whitaker's workforce seemed strangely fluid. Men would show up for their shifts, work with mechanical efficiency, and then disappear after only a few weeks or months. Callahan initially attributed this to the harsh working conditions of the oil industry, assuming that inexperienced laborers were simply moving on to easier jobs. But as he began to keep informal notes, Callahan realized that the disappearances followed no logical pattern. Some of the men who vanished were his most skilled workers, immigrants from Poland and Italy who had years of experience in the industry and should have been desperate for steady employment. Others were healthy young men from local farming families who had specifically sought out steady work to support their wives and children. Most disturbingly, several of the missing workers were men Callahan had known personally, men who had spoken of plans to bring their families to Titusville, who had been saving money to buy homes, who had shown every sign of wanting to build long-term lives in the area. Callahan's growing unease deepened when he tried to track down some of these missing workers. When he went to the boarding houses where they had lived, he discovered their rooms had been completely cleared out, as if they had never existed. When he inquired at the train station about tickets these men might have purchased, the clerks claimed to have no record of their travel. Most mysteriously, when Callahan tried to contact the families of local workers who had disappeared, he discovered that their relatives had received carefully crafted letters explaining that the men had found better opportunities in distant cities and would send for their loved ones once they were settled. These letters were convincing in their detail and seemed to reflect genuine knowledge of each man's past and personality. Yet, something about them troubled Callahan. The handwriting, though different in each case, showed subtle similarities that suggested they might have been written by the same person attempting to disguise their script. Even more disturbingly, some of the letters contained information that the workers themselves had never shared publicly, intimate details about family history and personal dreams that they had only discussed in private conversations with Callahan himself. Determined to solve the mystery, Callahan began to conduct his own investigation. He started arriving at the refinery before dawn and staying after sunset, observing the comings and goings of both workers and management. What he discovered sent a chill down his spine. In the pre-dawn hours, when the night shift was ending and the day shift had not yet begun, Callahan witnessed a series of activities that were never recorded in the official factory logs. Wagons would arrive at a rear entrance to the facility, their drivers bundled in heavy coats despite the mild autumn weather. These wagons carried what appeared to be groups of people, men, women, and even children, who moved with the stumbling gait of people who were either profoundly exhausted or under the influence of some substance. These new arrivals would be led directly into a section of the plant that Callahan had always assumed housed chemical storage facilities. But as he watched night after night, he realized that the people who entered this section during the pre-dawn deliveries never emerged during normal working hours. Instead, different individuals would appear in the main production areas. These men bore little resemblance to the people who had been brought in on the wagons, but somehow wore the same work clothes and carried the same lunch pails. Callahan's investigation took a terrifying turn when he decided to follow one of the mysterious wagons. On a moonless November night, He tailed a wagon that left the refinery around 3 a.m. The vehicle did not head toward any of Titusville's residential areas, but instead went deep into the countryside along roads that Callahan had never explored. After an hour of careful pursuit, the wagon turned onto a private road that led directly to Ravenswood Manor. Hiding in a grove of oak trees, Callahan watched as the wagon was unloaded at a basement entrance to the manor. The cargo consisted of about a dozen individuals moving with the same strangely lethargic gait he had observed at the factory, but these were not the rough-hewn working men he had expected. Instead, he saw well-dressed women, elderly couples, and a few children. All appeared to be unconscious or heavily sedated, requiring assistance to move from the wagon into the basement entrance. Most shockingly, Callahan recognized one of the women being carried into the manor. It was Mary Donahue, the young widow of an Irish immigrant who had worked briefly at the factory before mysteriously disappearing 8 months earlier. Mary had been frantic in her search for her husband, coming to the factory weekly to ask if anyone had news of him. Now, she was being carried unconscious into the basement of Harlan Whitaker's family estate. Callahan realized with growing horror that he had stumbled upon something far more sinister than mere labor recruitment. The people being brought to Ravenswood Manor were not willing workers seeking employment. They were victims of what could only be described as an organized kidnapping operation. The operation was clearly sophisticated, involving multiple locations and numerous accomplices, and it had been functioning for years without detection. The next morning, Callahan attempted to report his findings to the local sheriff, only to meet an unexpected obstacle. Sheriff Robert Miller, a portly man who had held the office for over a decade, listened to Callahan's story with growing irritation rather than alarm. When Callahan had finished his tale, the sheriff leaned back in his chair and stared at him. "John Callahan," the sheriff said slowly, "you're talking about one of the most respected men in Pennsylvania. Harlan Whitaker employs half this county and contributes more to our local charities than any other businessman. Do you really expect me to believe he's involved in kidnapping?" Callahan insisted on the truth of what he had witnessed, offering to lead the sheriff to the locations where he had observed the suspicious activities. But Miller refused to authorize any investigation, dismissing Callahan's allegations as the wild talk of a man who had been working too hard and drinking too much. When Callahan persisted, the sheriff threatened to arrest him for public intoxication and disturbing the peace. Frustrated but not deterred, Callahan next tried to bring his story to the attention of the local newspaper. The editor of the Titusville Herald, however, proved even less receptive than the sheriff. After listening politely to Callahan's story, the editor explained that his paper was heavily dependent on advertising revenue from Whitaker's various businesses. To print unsubstantiated allegations against such a crucial advertiser would be financial suicide for the paper. Callahan found himself trapped in a web of economic dependency that made exposing Whitaker's activities nearly impossible. Every institution in Titusville, from law enforcement and the press to local government and even the churches, relied on Whitaker's financial support. The oil tycoon had skillfully positioned himself as indispensable to the community's prosperity, creating a situation in which challenging him meant challenging the economic foundation of the entire region. But Callahan was not the only one who had begun to notice the disturbing patterns in Whitaker's operations. Sister Teresa Brennan, who ran the Catholic orphanage on the east side of Titusville, had been keeping her own informal records of missing persons. For the past 2 years, she had received numerous inquiries from families searching for relatives who had disappeared while seeking work or housing in the Titusville area. Sister Teresa's records revealed a pattern even more disturbing than the one Callahan had discovered. The missing persons included not just working-age men, but entire families who had responded to advertisements for domestic positions on Whitaker's various estates. These families had supposedly been hired for positions as gardeners, housekeepers, and tutors, but once they arrived to take up their new jobs, they seemed to vanish completely. The nun had attempted to visit several of the Whitaker estates to inquire about these missing families, only to be turned away by security guards, with the explanation that the families in question had moved on to other opportunities. When Sister Teresa persisted in her inquiries, she received a visit from Whitaker himself, who arrived at the orphanage with a generous donation and a gentle but firm suggestion that her time might be better spent tending to the children in her care rather than pursuing unfounded concerns about my domestic staff. The donation was large enough to fund the orphanage's operations for an entire year, and it came with the unspoken understanding that Sister Teresa's questions about the missing families should cease. Faced with the choice between pursuing her investigation and ensuring the survival of the institution that cared for dozens of homeless children, the nun reluctantly accepted Whitaker's terms. By the spring of 1887, a conspiracy of silence had settled over Titusville like a suffocating blanket. Those who had witnessed or suspected Whitaker's criminal activities found themselves isolated and powerless, trapped by their own economic vulnerability and the community's unwillingness to challenge its most important benefactor. The disappearances continued. The mysterious wagon deliveries continued under the cover of darkness, and Harlan Whitaker's reputation as a pillar of the community remained untarnished. But beneath the surface of this enforced silence, pressure was building. Callahan continued his nightly surveillance, recording everything he observed in a detailed journal that he hid in his boarding house room. Sister Teresa continued to maintain her files on the missing families, looking for patterns that might eventually provide proof of wrongdoing. Most importantly, several of Whitaker's wives had begun to ask uncomfortable questions about the activities they observed in their own homes. The veil of perfect domestic harmony that had made Whitaker's name throughout the Northeast was beginning to show cracks, and those cracks would soon widen into chasms that would expose the horrifying truth about America's most celebrated family man. The autumn of 1887 brought subtle but significant changes to the atmosphere inside Ravenswood Manor. The wives who had once moved through the manor's hallways with the easy confidence of women secure in their privileged positions now seemed to walk more carefully, speaking in hushed tones and casting anxious glances toward the sections of the house that had always been off-limits to family members. Abigail Thornton was Whitaker's first wife, having married him in a simple ceremony in 1870 when he was still a struggling oil prospector with ambitions that far outstripped his means. Over the course of their 17-year marriage, she had watched him transform from a charming but impoverished suitor into one of the most powerful men in Pennsylvania. She had also watched him accumulate additional wives with the same methodical approach he applied to acquiring oil rigs and railroad stock. Abigail's position as the senior wife gave her certain privileges and responsibilities within the complex hierarchy of the Whitaker household. She managed the domestic staff, coordinated the children's education, and served as Whitaker's official hostess for social events. These responsibilities also gave her access to information that the other wives did not have. And by 1887, that information was causing her considerable distress. The household accounting books, which Abigail reviewed monthly, revealed expenditures that made no sense in the context of their known family activities. Vast quantities of food were being purchased weekly, enough to feed a population 3 times the size of their actual household. Medical supplies were being ordered in quantities that suggested someone was operating a small hospital within the manor. Most puzzlingly, significant payments were being made to individuals whose names Abigail did not recognize and whose services were never explained. When Abigail questioned Whitaker about these mysterious expenses, he would smile and explain that his business interests required him to maintain facilities for visiting associates and that some of his employees received medical care through a private clinic he had established. These explanations seemed plausible, but they did not account for the sheer scale of the expenditures Abigail was seeing, nor did they explain why these facilities were never mentioned in any of Whitaker's public statements about his charitable activities. Abigail's concerns deepened when she began to notice changes in the behavior of the domestic staff. Several long-serving servants had recently been replaced with new employees who seemed unusually nervous and secretive. These new servants worked different shifts from the regular staff, arriving before dawn and leaving after sunset, and they were assigned specifically to maintain the restricted areas of the manor that family members were forbidden to enter. Most disturbingly, Abigail began to hear sounds from the basement areas that she could neither identify nor explain. Late at night, when the manor was supposed to be quiet and all family members were asleep, she would hear what sounded like machinery operating deep within the building. Sometimes there were voices, not the familiar tones of family members or the regular servants, but of strangers speaking in languages she could not identify. Occasionally, she heard what sounded like crying or pleading, sounds so faint that she could not be sure they were real. Abigail tried to share her concerns with the other senior wives, only to discover that they too had noticed disturbing changes in their domestic routine. Clara Bennett, Whitaker's fourth wife, reported that her youngest children had been having nightmares about sad people who lived in the walls of the house. Lydia Hayes, his sixth wife, mentioned that her teenage daughter had claimed to see strange faces looking out of windows in sections of the manor that were supposed to be unoccupied. The wives began to meet secretly in Abigail's sitting room to discuss their observations and concerns. What they discovered in these clandestine conversations painted a picture of systematic deception that had been going on for years. Each wife had noticed different pieces of a larger puzzle: the mysterious deliveries, their husbands' unexplained absences, the strange chemical odors emanating from certain parts of the house, and the presence of people who seemed to live in the manor but were never introduced to the family. Their investigation took a terrifying turn when Clara Bennett discovered a secret passage behind a bookshelf in the manor's library. The passage led to a narrow staircase that descended far deeper into the building than any of the wives had ever realized was possible. Following the staircase required considerable courage, but Clara's determination to understand what was happening in her own home drove her to explore further. The staircase ended at a heavy wooden door secured with multiple locks, but Clara could hear sounds coming from behind the door that confirmed her worst fears. There were definitely people on the other side, many of them, including children, and they were clearly in distress. The sounds included crying, coughing, and what seemed to be weak calls for help. Most chillingly, Clara could hear the sound of machinery that seemed to be in constant operation, accompanied by a rhythmic thudding that suggested some kind of manufacturing process was taking place in the basement areas. When Clara reported her findings to the other wives, they were faced with an impossible dilemma. They had discovered evidence that their husband was holding people captive directly beneath their own home, but they had no way to prove their suspicions without confronting Whitaker directly. Such a confrontation would not only end their privileged lives, but it might also place them and their children in grave danger if Whitaker was indeed capable of the criminal activities they suspected. Their decision was made for them when Henry, Abigail's 6-year-old youngest son, vanished for several hours one afternoon in October of 1888. The boy had been playing in the west wing of the manor when he suddenly disappeared, prompting a frantic search by family and servants. He was eventually found asleep in his own bed, with no memory of where he had been or how he had gotten there. But Henry's disappearance was accompanied by disturbing details that suggested he had been deliberately taken and returned. His clothes, which had been clean when he disappeared, were now filthy and smelled of the same strong chemical odor the wives had noticed in certain parts of the manor. Even more frightening, Henry had developed a severe cough and complained of a sore throat, symptoms that suggested he had been exposed to toxic fumes. When Abigail questioned her son about his missing hours, Henry became agitated and began talking about the people who worked downstairs and the sad place where no one can leave. He described seeing lots and lots of people in one big room and hearing loud banging noises that never stop. Most alarmingly, Henry claimed that someone had told him he was going to learn about the family business, but that he had been returned to his room because he was too little to understand. Abigail realized that her son had somehow gained access to the secret areas of the manor and had witnessed whatever operations Whitaker was conducting in the basements. The fact that Henry had been drugged or otherwise made to forget his experience suggested that Whitaker was willing to use chemical agents, even on his own children, to protect his secrets. The wives' growing knowledge of their husbands' criminal activities placed them in an increasingly precarious position. They could not go to the authorities because Whitaker's influence in Titusville made any official investigation unlikely. They could not simply leave because Whitaker controlled all their financial resources and had legal custody of their children. Most terrifyingly, they now understood that they were living directly above what appeared to be a prison where dozens of people were being held against their will. Their situation became even more dangerous When Whitaker began to show signs of suspecting that his wives were investigating his activities, he started asking pointed questions about their daily routines, checking on their whereabouts more frequently, and assigning specific servants to monitor their activities. The atmosphere in the manor grew increasingly tense as the wives tried to maintain the facade of domestic bliss while knowing that their own husband was a criminal of the worst imaginable kind. The breaking point came in December of 1888, when Clara Bennett discovered something that confirmed their worst fears about Whitaker's activities and revealed the true scale of his horrifying operations. Hidden behind a loose floorboard in her bedroom, she found a collection of personal items that had clearly been taken from numerous different people: jewelry, photographs, letters, and identity papers that told the stories of dozens of individuals who had disappeared from the Titusville area over the past several years. Among these items, Clara found a letter that sent a chill down her spine. It was addressed to Mary Donahue, the Irish widow whose husband had disappeared from the factory, and it contained her desperate plea to the Titusville sheriff for help in finding her missing husband. The letter was dated just 3 weeks before Callahan himself had seen Mary being carried unconscious into the manor's basement. Clara realized that she and the other wives were not just living with a criminal. They were living with a man who was systematically kidnapping, imprisoning, and possibly murdering innocent people. The beautiful manor that had been their sanctuary was in fact the headquarters of a criminal organization that preyed on society's most vulnerable members. But even this horrifying discovery was not the worst revelation that awaited the wives of Harlan Whitaker. The true scale of his operations and the ultimate fate of his victims would only be revealed when one of them decided to risk everything to expose the monster they had unknowingly married and the nightmare that existed just beneath their feet. Hannah Lowell had always been different from Whitaker's other wives. A former journalist from Philadelphia who had married him in 1886, she possessed an analytical mind and a fierce independence that had initially attracted Whitaker, but now seemed to increasingly irritate him. Unlike the other wives who had gradually accepted the limitations and mysteries of life at Ravenswood Manor, Hannah continued to ask questions and seek answers to the contradictions she observed in their household. Her opportunity to uncover the truth came in February of 1889 when Whitaker left for a business trip to Pittsburgh that was scheduled to last 2 weeks. For the first time since her arrival at the manor, Hannah found herself with extended periods of time when her movements were not being closely monitored by her husband or his specially assigned servants. Hannah had been quietly studying the architectural plans of the manor for months, paying particular attention to architectural inconsistencies that suggested the existence of hidden spaces and passages. The original construction of the building had been completed in 1875, but significant additions and modifications had been made in subsequent years. These modifications seemed designed not only to accommodate Whitaker's growing family, but also to create concealed areas that could serve purposes unknown to the manor's official residents. Using the investigative skills she had acquired as a journalist, Hannah began to map the hidden geography of the manor. She discovered that the basement extended far beyond what was visible from the main house, comprising a network of subterranean chambers that connected not only to different parts of the manor, but also to external structures on the estate. Her exploration began in the early morning hours when the rest of the family was still asleep. Following the passage that Clara Bennett had discovered behind the library bookshelf, Hannah descended the narrow staircase to the locked door at its base. But instead of trying to open that door, she continued to explore the surrounding area and discovered additional passages that provided alternative routes into the subterranean complex. What Hannah found beyond those passages would haunt her for the rest of her life. The basement of Ravenswood Manor was not a single large space, but a labyrinth of interconnected chambers that had been converted into what could only be described as an underground factory. The chambers contained industrial equipment, including vats for crude oil distillation, mechanical tools, and machinery for chemical processing. But the most horrifying aspect of these facilities was not their equipment. It was their workforce. Dozens of people were held captive in the basement chambers, living and working in conditions that defied human decency. Men, women, and children were chained to workstations where they operated machinery for refining oil and producing byproducts. They worked in shifts that lasted 18 to 20 hours with brief rest periods on straw pallets laid directly on the stone floor. The captives seemed to represent a cross-section of Titusville's missing persons, immigrant families, transient workers, the homeless, and even some local residents who had supposedly left town to seek opportunities elsewhere. They were controlled through a combination of physical restraints, inadequate nutrition, and what appeared to be regular doses of laudanum or some other sedative that kept them docile and confused. Hannah realized that she was witnessing the source of Whitaker's spectacular business success. While his competitors struggled with labor costs and worker strikes, Whitaker had solved these problems by creating a slave labor force that cost him nothing beyond the expense of kidnapping and imprisoning his victims. The oil products that had made his name throughout the Northeast were being produced by people who had been stolen from their families and forced to work until they died of exhaustion or disease. But the subterranean complex contained horrors that went beyond even slave labor. In the deepest chambers of the facility, Hannah discovered what Whitaker did with the captives who became too sick or weak to continue working. These individuals were not released or given medical care. They were killed, and their bodies were disposed of through a process that explained the most disturbing aspect of Whitaker's business operations. The final chamber in the subterranean complex housed a massive furnace that was designed not for industrial waste, but for the incineration of human remains. The bodies of deceased captives were fed into this furnace, where they were reduced to ash. These ashes were then processed and mixed with the crude oil during the refining process. This meant that the oil products sold by the Whitaker Oil Company literally contained the remains of his victims. Hannah's discovery explained the superior quality of Whitaker's oil products, which had puzzled his competitors who could not understand how he achieved such purity with seemingly standard methods. The addition of human ash to his process had created a final product that appeared cleaner, giving Whitaker a significant competitive advantage in the market. The realization that she had been living above this crematorium for 3 years, sleeping peacefully while dozens of people suffered and died beneath her feet, so horrified Hannah that she initially wondered if she had lost her mind. The man she had married, who had courted her with fine words and lavish gifts, who played gently with his children and spoke eloquently of building a better future for America, was a monster whose crimes were beyond anything she had ever imagined. But Hannah's horror was matched by her determination to expose Whitaker's operations and rescue his victims. She spent the remaining days of his absence documenting everything she had discovered, creating detailed maps of the subterranean complex and compiling a list of the captives she had observed. She also began to formulate a plan to alert the authorities outside of Titusville. Realizing that Whitaker's local influence made it impossible to seek help from the town's law enforcement or government officials, her plan was complicated by the realization that she could not act alone. The subterranean complex was too well guarded and too well protected for one person to liberate the captives. Furthermore, any rescue attempt would need to be coordinated with outside assistance to ensure that the victims could be safely removed from the Whitaker estate and protected from his inevitable retaliation. Hannah's investigation also revealed the full extent of Whitaker's criminal organization. The kidnapping operations that supplied victims for his underground factory were coordinated through a network of accomplices that included corrupt law enforcement officers, unscrupulous business partners, and criminals who specialized in human trafficking. The operation extended beyond Pennsylvania, including procurement networks in New York, Ohio, and Maryland, making it a multi-state criminal enterprise of unprecedented scale. Most chillingly, Hannah discovered evidence that Whitaker's activities were not simply the result of greed or business ambition. Hidden among his personal papers, she found journals that revealed his philosophical justification for his crimes. Whitaker saw himself as a pioneer of industrial efficiency, a man who had discovered how to eliminate the wasteful aspects of human labor by reducing workers to their most essential function, the production of goods. His writings revealed a man who had gradually lost all sense of human empathy and morality, one who viewed other people as nothing more than components in an industrial process. He wrote at length of his plans to expand his operations, establishing similar facilities in other cities, and eventually creating a nationwide network of hidden factories powered by slave laborers. Hannah realized that Whitaker's crimes were not just individual acts of murder and kidnapping, but a systematic attempt to reduce human beings to the level of industrial machinery. His success in Titusville was only the first step in a plan that could have destroyed thousands of lives across the country. When Whitaker returned from his business trip, Hannah was waiting for him with a decision that would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of all those trapped in the nightmare he had created just beneath their feet. The final confrontation between wife and husband would bring his entire horrifying empire to light and set in motion the events that would shatter the foundations of Titusville's most powerful family. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror in Ravenswood Manor escalates. If this story is sending shivers down your spine, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit the like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Together, let's find out what happens when Hannah finally confronts the monster she married. Whitaker returned from Pittsburgh on a cold February evening in 1889. The wheels of his carriage crunching through the snow that had fallen during his absence. Hannah watched from her bedroom window as he stepped from the carriage, his golden hair glinting in the lamplight, his bearing as confident and aristocratic as ever. To any observer, he appeared to be exactly what he had always seemed, a successful businessman returning home to his loving family after a successful trip. Only Hannah knew that she was watching a predator returning to his lair. She had spent the time of his absence not only documenting his crimes, but also grappling with the terrible knowledge of what kind of man she had shared a bed with for 3 years. The charming conversations they had had, the intimate moments they had shared, the future they had planned together, had all been a lie, a performance by a man capable of unspeakable cruelty toward his fellow human beings. Hannah had decided that she could not continue to live this lie. The moral weight of her knowledge, combined with the ongoing suffering of the captives beneath her feet, made it impossible for her to maintain the facade of domestic bliss. She would confront Whitaker with her findings and demand that he release his victims immediately. If he refused, she was prepared to take whatever actions were necessary to expose his crimes, regardless of the personal consequences. The confrontation took place in Whitaker's private study, a lavishly appointed room lined with books of law and business documents that had always been a symbol of his success and prestige. Hannah waited until the rest of the family had gone to bed, then knocked softly on the study door. When Whitaker bade her enter, she found him sitting behind his mahogany desk, reviewing correspondence from his Pittsburgh meetings. "Harlan," she began, her voice steady despite the terror she felt. "We need to discuss what you have been doing in the basement of this house." Whitaker looked up from his papers with an expression of mild curiosity, as if Hannah had inquired about the weather or the dinner menu. "I'm afraid I don't understand, my dear. The basement contains storage facilities for the household, nothing that should concern you." Hannah had anticipated his denial and had come prepared with specific details that would make further deception impossible. "I have seen the captives, Harlan. I have seen the factory equipment and the furnace where you burn their bodies. I know about the kidnapping network and the production of the oil that has made you rich. I know everything." For a moment, Whitaker's polite, quizzical expression remained in place. Then, slowly, his expression began to change. The warm smile vanished from his lips, and his eyes became cold and calculating. When he spoke again, his voice carried a tone that Hannah had never heard before, flat, emotionless, and utterly devoid of human warmth. "You have been a very busy woman in my absence," he said quietly. "I underestimated your curiosity. That is a mistake I will not make again." Hannah felt a shiver of terror run down her spine as she realized that the man sitting opposite her was no longer bothering to maintain his human facade. The mask had finally slipped, revealing something far more dangerous than she had imagined, but she forced herself to continue the confrontation she knew might be her only chance to save the captives and expose Whitaker's crimes. "Those people downstairs have families who are looking for them," she said. "They have children who don't understand why their parents never came home. You must let them go, Harlan. You must end this nightmare." Whitaker leaned back in his chair and regarded her with the same detached interest he might have shown for a particularly challenging business problem. "I'm afraid that's impossible, Hannah. Those people serve a vital function in my operation. They represent a solution to the fundamental inefficiency of conventional labor practices. To release them would be counterproductive." The mechanical way he spoke of human beings as problems of efficiency revealed the depth of his moral depravity. Hannah realized she was not reasoning with a man who had temporarily lost his way, but with someone who had completely abandoned the basic principles of human decency. "They are human beings, Harlan," she said desperately. "They are not machines or raw materials. They have souls. They have hopes and dreams and people who love them. How can you treat them as if they are nothing more than tools for your factory?" Whitaker's reply chilled her to the bone. Hopes and dreams are luxuries that interfere with productivity. Love is a weakness that prevents people from accepting their proper role in an industrial society. I have simply eliminated these inefficiencies from my workforce. The results speak for themselves. My oil is superior to anything produced by conventional methods. Hannah understood that reason would not sway a man who had so completely abandoned his own humanity. She changed her approach, appealing to his self-interest rather than his conscience. "The authorities will eventually discover what you are doing. Someone will notice the missing people. Someone will investigate the unusual success of your business. When that happens, you will lose everything: your fortune, your reputation, your freedom. Is it really worth the risk?" Whitaker smiled at her question, but there was no warmth in the expression. "The authorities in Titusville are well paid for their discretion. The business community benefits too much from my success to ask uncomfortable questions, and the victims I choose are selected specifically because they will not be missed. Immigrants with no connections, the homeless, families with no local ties. I have been operating for over 7 years without detection. I see no reason for that to change." The casual way he discussed the selection of his victims revealed the systematic nature of his crimes. This was not a man who had stumbled into criminality, but one who had carefully planned and executed a multi-year campaign of kidnapping and murder. Hannah realized that negotiation and persuasion would accomplish nothing with such a man. "I will not be a party to this," she declared. "I am leaving this house tonight, and I will contact federal authorities who are beyond your influence. I will make sure that everyone knows what you have done." Whitaker's expression did not change, but something in his posture made Hannah suddenly aware of how isolated and vulnerable she was. They were alone in the study. The rest of the family was asleep, and she was facing a man who had demonstrated his willingness to imprison and murder innocent people. "I'm afraid that will not be possible," Whitaker said softly. "You have seen too much. Know too much. I cannot allow you to leave this house with the knowledge you now possess." Hannah felt panic rise in her chest as she realized that her confrontation with Whitaker had been a terrible mistake. She had assumed that her status as his wife would offer some measure of protection, that even a man capable of such crimes would hesitate to harm the woman he had claimed to love. But she now understood that Whitaker was incapable of genuine love or attachment, that she was no safer than any of his other victims. "The other wives know what I have discovered," she said quickly, hoping to deter him with the threat of additional witnesses. "Abigail, Clara, and Lydia all know about the captives. If anything happens to me, they will go to the authorities." Whitaker considered this information with the same machine-like detachment he had shown throughout their conversation. "That is unfortunate," he said finally. "I had hoped to avoid complications with the rest of my family, but if they have become security risks, then adjustments will need to be made." The implication of his words struck Hannah like a physical blow. He was not only planning to silence her, but he was prepared to murder his other wives and possibly his own children to protect his criminal operations. The man she had married was not just a criminal. He was a monster who would destroy anyone who threatened his carefully constructed empire of suffering and death. Hannah realized that her only chance of survival lay in immediate escape. She had to reach the outside world and alert authorities beyond Whitaker's reach before he could implement whatever plan he was now developing to silence her and the other wives. But as she turned toward the study door, she discovered that her options for escape had already been eliminated. Standing in the doorway were two men she had never seen before. Both were dressed in the rough clothing of oil rig workers, but they had the watchful bearing of professional guards. Their presence confirmed that Whitaker had anticipated this confrontation and had made preparations for the possibility that his wife might become a threat to his operation. "Hannah," Whitaker said calmly, "I would like you to meet two of my most trusted associates. They are going to help you relocate to a section of the house where you will be more comfortable and where we can continue our discussion without interruption." She understood that relocate meant imprisonment, and that any further discussion was likely to involve torture designed to extract information about what she had told the other wives. The realization that she was about to become another victim of the monster she had married so overwhelmed her with despair that for a moment she considered surrendering to her fate. But then she thought of the dozens of captives suffering in the basement chambers, of the families still searching for their missing loved ones, of the other victims who would be kidnapped and murdered if Whitaker's operations were allowed to continue. Her own personal fate mattered less than stopping the systematic destruction of innocent lives that was taking place under the respectable facade of Ravenswood Manor. With a sudden burst of desperate courage, Hannah lunged for the study window, hoping to break the glass and alert the outside world to what was happening inside the manor. But the guards moved faster than she did, grabbing her arms and restraining her from escape. As they dragged her from the study, she managed one last act of defiance that would ultimately prove more significant than either she or Whitaker realized at the time. Hidden in the folds of her dress was the detailed map she had drawn of the subterranean complex, along with the list of captives she had observed and the evidence she had gathered on Whitaker's criminal organization. As the guards pulled her toward the door, she managed to drop these documents behind Whitaker's desk, where they fell into a gap between the desk and the wall. Neither Whitaker nor his guards noticed her action, and the documents would remain hidden there for months, waiting to be discovered by someone who could use them to expose the truth about America's most celebrated family man and his empire of suffering. As Hannah was dragged from the study toward her own imprisonment in the same basement chambers she had discovered, she could hear Whitaker already making plans to deal with his other wives. The nightmare that had begun with the kidnapping of strangers was about to expand to include his own family, and the respectable facade of Ravenswood Manor was about to crumble under the weight of crimes that defied human comprehension. The transformation of Ravenswood Manor from a symbol of domestic harmony into a fortress of terror began immediately after Hannah's confrontation with her husband. Within hours of her disappearance into the basement chambers, Whitaker had implemented security measures that turned his estate into a prison for his remaining wives and children. The other wives awoke the next morning to find armed guards posted throughout the manor. These men claimed to be providing enhanced security due to recent threats against the family. These guards, drawn from the same criminal network that supplied Whitaker's kidnapping victims, made it clear that no family member was permitted to leave the estate without Whitaker's explicit permission. Abigail Thornton, as the senior wife, attempted to inquire about Hannah's whereabouts, only to be told that Hannah had taken ill during the night and was receiving medical treatment at a private facility. When Abigail pressed for more details, she was informed politely but firmly that further questions about Hannah's condition would not be welcomed. The wives quickly realized that they had become prisoners in their own home. Their movements within the manor were restricted to specific areas, their mail was monitored, and their interactions with the servants were closely supervised. Most ominously, their children were separated from them under the guise of providing specialized tutoring, but were in fact being held as hostages to ensure their mother's cooperation. Whitaker himself seemed to have undergone a complete transformation. The charming, attentive husband they had known was replaced by a cold, calculating man who regarded them with the same machine-like detachment he had shown for his kidnapped victims. In the few, rare instances when he spoke to them, he made it clear that their safety depended entirely on their willingness to maintain absolute silence about anything they might have observed or suspected concerning his business activities. The atmosphere of fear that now pervaded the manor was made even more intense by the sounds that echoed up from the basements. Sounds that suggested the captives below were being subjected to increased brutality. The wives could hear screams that lasted for hours, the sound of machinery operating at full capacity, and what sounded like construction work as Whitaker apparently expanded his subterranean facilities to accommodate more victims. But even as Whitaker tightened his control over his family and his criminal operations, forces beyond his influence had begun to converge on Titusville. The systematic disappearance of so many people over such a long period of time had finally attracted the attention of federal investigators who were not subject to local corruption and political influence. Agent Samuel Harding of the newly formed Bureau of Investigation had been tracking reports of missing persons across several states when he noticed an unusual concentration of disappearances in the Titusville area. Unlike the local law enforcement officials who had dismissed these reports as isolated incidents, Harding recognized the pattern of an organized criminal enterprise operating on a scale unprecedented in American history. Harding's investigation had been initiated by a letter from Sister Teresa Brennan, who had finally overcome her fear of Whitaker's retaliation and had written to federal authorities detailing her concerns about the missing families. The nun's detailed files on the missing persons, combined with similar reports from other cities, provided Harding with evidence of a criminal network that crossed state lines and therefore fell under federal jurisdiction. The federal investigation gained further momentum when Harding was contacted by John Callahan, the factory foreman, who had been conducting his own surveillance of Whitaker's activities. Callahan's detailed journal of suspicious activities at the refinery, combined with his eyewitness testimony of the mysterious deliveries to Ravenswood Manor, provided federal agents with the concrete evidence of criminal activity that could justify a formal investigation. Most importantly, Harding's investigation received crucial assistance from an unexpected source: Dr. Arthur Finch, the physician who had treated some of Whitaker's workers for unusual injuries and illnesses. Dr. Finch had been puzzled by the medical conditions he observed in patients referred from Whitaker's businesses. Injuries consistent with prolonged confinement and malnutrition, symptoms of chemical poisoning that suggested exposure to industrial processes, and psychological trauma that indicated severe abuse. When Dr. Finch learned of the federal investigation, he provided Harding with medical records that documented the systematic abuse of workers at Whitaker's facilities. These records, combined with the other evidence gathered by federal agents, established sufficient grounds for a full-scale investigation of Whitaker's business operations and personal properties. The federal raid on Ravenswood Manor took place on the 28th of February, 1889, just 3 weeks after Hannah's confrontation with her husband. Federal agents, accompanied by military personnel from a nearby unit, surrounded the estate before dawn and secured all entrances to prevent the destruction of evidence or the escape of suspects. Whitaker himself was arrested in his study, where agents found him calmly destroying business documents that detailed his criminal operations. His attempt to eliminate evidence was only partially successful, as federal agents had been prepared for such tactics and had moved quickly to secure the most critical areas of the estate. The discovery of the subterranean complex beneath Ravenswood Manor shocked even the most seasoned federal agents, who had witnessed the worst of America's criminal underworld. The scale of the operation, the number of victims, the sophistication of the facilities, the systematic nature of the abuse were beyond anything in their previous experience. When they found the furnace used to dispose of human remains, several agents became physically ill at the realization of what they were witnessing. The rescue of the surviving captives became a massive humanitarian operation that required medical personnel, social workers, and interpreters who could communicate with victims from dozens of different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds. Many of the captives were so psychologically traumatized that they could not immediately comprehend that they were being rescued. Others were so physically debilitated by malnutrition and abuse that they required immediate hospitalization. Among the captives rescued from the basement chambers was Hannah Lowell, who had survived her 3-week imprisonment by maintaining her sanity with the hope that someone would eventually discover the truth about Whitaker's operations. Her testimony, combined with the documents she had hidden behind Whitaker's desk, provided federal investigators with detailed evidence of the scale and methods of his criminal enterprise. The investigation into Whitaker's activities revealed the full extent of his crimes against humanity. Over the course of 7 years, he had been responsible for the kidnapping and imprisonment of more than 350 people. Of these victims, fewer than 90 survived to be rescued. The rest had died of exhaustion, disease, industrial accidents, or had been deliberately killed when they became too weak to continue working. The case of Harlan Whitaker became one of the most closely followed trials in American history. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including the testimony of dozens of survivors, physical evidence from his subterranean facilities, and the detailed records he had kept of his own criminal activities. The prosecution presented a case that revealed not just individual acts of murder and kidnapping, but a systematic attempt to reduce human beings to the level of industrial equipment. Whitaker's defense attorneys attempted to argue that their client was insane, that no rational person could have conceived and executed such monstrous crimes, but the extensive planning and sophisticated organization of Whitaker's operations indicated a calculating intelligence that made claims of insanity untenable. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Harlan Whitaker was executed by hanging on the 12th of October 1890 in the courtyard of the Pennsylvania State Prison. He showed no remorse for his crimes and offered no statement beyond a brief comment that his methods would one day be recognized as pioneering contributions to industrial efficiency. Even in death, he remained convinced that his reduction of human beings to their productive components represented progress rather than an abomination against human decency. The surviving wives and children of Harlan Whitaker faced their own challenges in the aftermath of his execution. Though they were cleared of any involvement in his crimes, they had to bear the burden of having lived unknowingly above one of the worst criminal enterprises in American history. Several of the wives, including Abigail Thornton, changed their names and moved to distant states where they could begin new lives free from the shadow of their husband's infamy. Hannah Lowell, whose courage in confronting Whitaker had been instrumental in exposing his crimes, became an advocate for the rights of kidnapping victims and worked with federal authorities to improve methods for investigating organized criminal activity. She never remarried, dedicating the rest of her life to ensuring that the suffering of Whitaker's victims would not be forgotten. The Whitaker Oil Company was permanently shut down, and the manor that had housed his criminal operations was demolished by order of a federal court. The grounds were eventually converted into a memorial garden where the names of Whitaker's victims are inscribed on stone tablets, providing a permanent reminder of the human cost of unchecked industrial ambition and moral decay. The case of Harlan Whitaker fundamentally changed the American understanding of organized crime and industrial abuse. It led to new federal laws on labor practices, increased penalties for kidnapping and human trafficking, and established procedures for federal investigation of crimes that crossed state lines. The Bureau of Investigation, which had played such a crucial role in exposing Whitaker's operations, was expanded and given additional resources to combat similar criminal enterprises. Perhaps most importantly, the Whitaker case served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing economic success and social prestige to shield criminal activity from scrutiny. The fact that such monstrous crimes could be committed by a man celebrated as a pillar of the community demonstrated the need for constant vigilance against those who would exploit society's most vulnerable members. The legacy of Harlan Whitaker's crimes continues to echo through American history as a reminder that true evil often hides behind a facade of respectability and success. His story stands as a testament to the courage of individuals like Hannah Lowell, John Callahan, and Sister Teresa Brennan, who risked everything to expose the truth and save innocent lives. This mystery shows us that even in America's gilded age of prosperity and progress, the darkness of human cruelty can thrive in the shadows of respectability. The oil tycoon who seemed to have it all, wealth, power, and a perfect family, turned out to be a monster whose crimes defy comprehension. What do you think about this story? Do you believe such systematic evil could exist undetected for so long? Leave your comments below and share your thoughts on how ordinary people can stand up to extraordinary evil. If you enjoyed this story and want more chilling tales like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with a fellow mystery lover. See you in the next video.